Throughout history, execution by firing squad has been a particular methodology of capital punishment. It's an intrinsic practice within the military universe, mainly in times of war. The choice of this method is justified by the widespread availability of firearms and the lethal effectiveness of a single shot aimed at vital organs, such as the brain or the heart. However, during World War II, this procedure was used in the most macabre and bloody ways, especially by the Nazis. In today's video, we will walk among the thousands of corpses left by this practice, trying to understand why it was employed, as well as the most resonant executions in history. Prepare for a video where death is common currency, so if you are sensitive viewers, we recommend caution. Welcome once again to military history. A firing squad is composed of several soldiers who receive the order to open fire simultaneously against one or more condemned individuals. This synchronization not only ensures the effectiveness of the process, but also preserves the anonymity of the shooter of the fatal shot. In order to avoid disfigurement caused by multiple shots to the head, the shooters are directed to aim at the heart, occasionally guided by a paper or cloth target. The condemned individual is usually blindfolded and additionally immobilized. In some jurisdictions, there is a tradition of conducting executions at dawn, attempting to preserve a symbolic charge in the action. In certain cases, the so-called coup de grace is incorporated, executed by the squad's officer with a pistol if the initial discharge is not immediately fatal. This method is often used as a capital sentence or disciplinary measure imposed by military tribunals for crimes such as cowardice, desertion, espionage, murder, mutiny, or treason. In a particularly cruel twist, the condemned may face the dishonor of being shot in the back, deprived of blindfolds, or even tied to chairs, as an expression of contempt towards them. Conversely, for some condemned officers who have shown bravery throughout their careers, the macabre privilege of giving the order to fire may be granted, a bitter irony in military justice. A case of such a more ceremonial murder was suffered by a group of Italian spies in the landscape of the pumice quarry of Sant'Angelo in Formis on April 30, 1944. 4 young volunteers from the Italian Social Republic faced death with indomitable bravery and admirable serenity for the enemy army. The daring condemned were Franco Eschieri, a Roman paratrooper from the EX3CUTlONS, Natale Italo Palese, Mario Topoli Timperi, a medical student with roots in Rome, and Vincenzo Tedesco. These 4 men marched towards their final destination, singing the anthems of their homeland, an act that earned the respect of the Allied officers and soldiers who supervised the execution. Palese, facing the firing squad, refused to be blindfolded and requested to light a last cigarette to meet death, looking it in the eyes and smoking calmly. In his final moments, he uttered a provocative shout to his executioners, "Damn the English!" The Italian, firm before the firing squad, challenged those about to shoot to kill with a provocative order that would be his last word and sentence. He only shouted, "Fire!" In another paradigmatic case, once the war was over, the Allies used this method of execution as an exemplary punishment, clearly with much less cruelty and cynicism than the Nazis, but with a hint of controversial impropriety. Anton Dostler is a name that went down in history for his conviction in the Nuremberg trials. He is a controversial figure in German military history who participated in both world wars. During the Second World War, his role as an infantry general in Italy led him to command several units, but his luck darkened after the Axis defeat and his involvement in war crimes. Dostler was tried by the Allies during the early war crimes proceedings at the end of the conflict. In Nuremberg, he faced specific charges for ordering the execution of 15 American prisoners of war in March 1944 during the Italian campaign. His defense strategy focused on arguing that the executions were carried out under superior orders, presenting a defense that absolved him of individual responsibility. However, the judges of the tribunal vehemently rejected this stance, thus setting a historic precedent that obeying superior orders did not exempt perpetrators of war crimes from responsibility. The verdict was damning for Dostler, and the sentence was death. At 8 o'clock in the morning on December 1, 1945, in Aversa, Italy, Anton Dostler faced a firing squad composed of 12 men from the U.S. Army. His execution was captured on black and white film, remaining forever in history as one of the most important executed figures of modern history. As we have just seen, originally there was supposed to be a reserve of honor or justice in this type of fatal ceremony. The condemned prisoners were generally soldiers who understood the type of punishment that awaited them. However, in the case of the Nazis, this type of execution was used so brutally that it ended up directly becoming genocide. In the dizzying summer of 1941, Hitler's machinery of horror took on a new and brutal dimension with the invasion of the Soviet Union. German forces, imbued with the doctrine of annihilation warfare, unleashed a storm of terror on the Soviet population. In the sights of this brutal offensive were communists, Jews, Roma, and Soviet civilians labeled as undesirables. During Operation Barbarossa, the beginning of mass shootings was almost immediate. The SS began by executing Jewish men of military age. However, by August 1941, an unprecedented escalation of murders occurred when the German army massacred entire Jewish communities without distinction of age or gender. This was the prelude to the final solution to the Jewish problem, which would ultimately become the systematic plan for the extermination of the Holocaust. The Einsatzgruppen, famous special units of the German security police and the SD, were the face of these horrific massacres. Although they had only 3,000 personnel deployed along the Eastern Front, their role was prominent, being the unit with the highest murder rate. However, they were not alone, as Order Police battalions, Waffen-SS units, and German army troops also participated in these mass murders. But the Einsatzgruppen stood out for the hatred they emanated and the savagery of their executions. The standard procedure of this ominous spectacle, known in German as Action, began with German units and local collaborators gathering the Jewish population from villages, towns, or cities. Then, they were taken towards the outskirts of the settlement, to a predetermined destination as if they were cattle. Secondly, they were lined up in front of mass graves, either already prepared or dug at that moment by the victims themselves. Then, without prior warning or ceremony, the symphony of German machine guns began. Bullets pierced the bodies of men, women, and children who fell lifeless and shattered into the pits they had been forced to dig. The sinister circle was completed when the next batch of prisoners covered the corpses with dirt, and once the work was finished, they became the next inhabitants of that inhumane mass grave. The scene unfolded in broad daylight like a nightmare in the presence of local residents, powerless witnesses to the tragedy unfolding in their communities. However, the most suffering witnesses were the family members themselves who saw their loved ones executed, knowing that in a matter of minutes they would suffer the same fate. Mass shootings were not an easy task. The resources used, from shooters to weapons and transportation, were extremely precious in the midst of war. Moreover, the devastating effect of these executions on the psyche of the perpetrators was causing and desertions in the Wehrmacht. For that reason, an alternative emerged: gas vans. These were vehicles equipped with hoses that pumped carbon monoxide from the exhaust into the sealed rear compartment where Jewish passengers were crowded and murdered. This horrific practice was discussed at the Nuremberg trials.
Another form of extermination employed was asphyxiation by lethal gases in enclosed trucks or vans. Here again, the victims were induced to enter these death machines by the promise that they would be transported to other areas for resettlement. As the van left the loading area, it was filled with deadly fumes. A few minutes later, when the van reached the disposal point, the corpses were unloaded into prepared excavations, which became unmarked mass graves. These, then, were the usual methods used by the Einsatzgruppen.
However, this alternative did not prosper due to the high costs and because it was much more cumbersome and less efficient than shootings. The German personnel, for their part, also showed their displeasure at having to deal with the removal of bodies and the cleaning of the van compartments. For this reason, the German High Command insisted on continuing to perfect and optimize the sinister method of mass shootings to achieve unprecedented extermination rates. Next, we will share some of the most striking examples which have been marked in history for their level of violence and darkness. In the grim August of 1941, Kamianets-Podilskyi plunged into the despair of tragedy. Units of the SS and the German police, supported by Ukrainian auxiliaries, unleashed a massacre that would leave an indelible scar. In the span of just 3 days, from August 26 to 28, 23,000 Jewish lives were exterminated throughout this city in occupied Ukraine. Among the victims were not only local Jews, but also those who, banished from Hungarian territory, met their tragic end at the hands of the Germans. The horror did not relent, and barely a month later, calamity shifted towards Kiev, where a geographical accident unknown until then would become synonymous with terror. Between September 29 and 30 in 1941, units of the SS, the German police, and their local collaborators carried out a massacre that would mark the fate of the Jewish population in the Ukrainian capital. Babi Yar, a ravine on the outskirts of the city, bore witness to the fall of 33,171 Jewish souls in just 2 days of extreme fatality. That abyss, stained with the blood of innocent men, women, and children, would become one of the favorite places to dispose of bodies by the forces of the Third Reich until the end of the occupation. After the initial massacre, Babi Yar was the sinister stage where the Germans destroyed the lives of tens of thousands of people between 1941 and 1943. The balance of brutality reached astronomical proportions. Historians estimate that around 100,000 people met their death in this abyss of pain. Kamianets-Podilskyi and Babi Yar, two names that resonate with atrocity in a dark chapter of history, where compassion was eclipsed by the most appalling inhumanity. During World War II, Hitler's forces chose conquered territories from the Soviets as points for intensive shooting training. The operation was the same in all cases. Sites on the outskirts of cities were chosen to avoid the highest number of witnesses and to dispose of bodies with the least amount of inconvenience possible. Likewise, they attempted to do so in inhospitable places where nature facilitated the task of discarding the corpses. Among these scenes of horror, some infamous extermination sites stand out, such as Fort Nime in Kovno, the forests of Rumbula, and Bajkarnieki in Riga. Ponary near Vilna was also used, and finally, Mali Trostanets near Minsk. In these lands stained with blood by Nazi brutality, Reich soldiers massacred tens of thousands of people, most of them Jews. It should be noted that since the extermination camps were not yet at their peak, many of the undesirables deported were transferred to these sites to be coldly executed. Furthering their shooting strategy in the Soviet tundra, the Germans diversified efforts and found various suitable scenarios to perfect their killing machinery. In the tragic days following the German occupation of Latvia in 1941, the city of Liepāja became the scene of unimaginable horror. The massacres, many of them ruthlessly public, left a dark and brutal account on the western coast of Latvia. The action unfolded with the involvement of the Einsatzgruppen, as well as auxiliary police forces and Latvian militias that took care of liquidating their compatriots. Approximately 5,000 Jewish men, women, and children, 100 Roma, 30 mentally ill individuals, and some insubordinate civilians were exterminated in this event. Unlike other Holocaust events in Latvia, the murders took place in broad daylight, in open places, becoming harrowing memories for local witnesses. Reynes Park in the city center, the port, the Olympic Stadium, and the lighthouse were the chosen sites to carry out these unforgettable atrocities. A sinister climax of horror took place in the dunes embracing Šķede, north of the city, in a disused Latvian army training camp. Between December 15 and 17, 1941, German forces and collaborators carried out the largest massacre of the occupation, executed in one day, ending the lives of 2,731 Jews and 23 communists. Šķede became a silent witness to human cruelty, a place where history left an indelible wound. The tragedy in Liepāja, though atrocious and difficult to assimilate, has allowed memory to persist clearer than in other Latvian cities. Except for Riga, no other locality bears the burden of knowing in more detail the horror that was unleashed in its streets during the Nazi occupation. Once the trial of this method was standardized in 1941 during Operation Barbarossa and other occupation operations, the Third Reich systematized and mass-executed executions throughout the territory under its power. In the dark advent of the Holocaust, the greatest number of deaths did not take place in the territories conquered from the Soviets, but in the very heart of the general government, a part of occupied Poland. The architects of atrocity baptized this unprecedented massacre as the Harvest Festival Operation, or Erntefest in German. This gloomy, deadly feast aimed at the elimination of the remaining Jews in that jurisdiction, revealing another, even darker chapter of the Führer's destruction machinery. The days of November 3 and 4, 1943, were marked in the history of the 20th century by the echo of fired rifles and the unbearable cries in the Lublin-Majdanek concentration camp, as well as in the forced labor camps of Troniki and Poniatowa. SS and German police units gathered Jewish prisoners from these sinister enclosures and led them to freshly excavated graves, destined to become the final resting place for thousands of unfortunate prisoners. The brutal Erntefest operation, carried out in just 2 days, ended the lives of approximately 42,000 Jews, marking a grim epilogue for Operation Reinhard. This designation was nothing more than the code name for the macabre German plan that sought the elimination of nearly 2 million Jews residing in the general government. With these monstrous executions, the operation came to an end. The bodies of the executed met different fates, but most were discarded in mass graves or cremated, leaving a void in their families who could never mourn their victims. As we have described, Hitler's Germany and its allies carried out mass shootings in the territories seized from Soviet forces, infamously known in history as the Holocaust by bullets. In the dark pages of history, the truth about the exact number of victims exterminated in the mass shootings of the Holocaust is incalculable due to the systematic destruction of evidence perpetrated by the Germans. The senselessness of the tragedy, recorded in scattered war reports and in demographic studies of pre- and post-war Jewish communities, yields painful estimates. Historians suggest that the Nazis could have ended the lives of at least 2 million individuals with this execution technique. However, because many bodies were buried in mass graves, thrown off cliffs into the void or the sea, or even incinerated in the middle of nowhere, it is likely that the victims are many more. The immeasurable sorrow can only be remembered and traversed, recalling the tragic events that occurred and ensuring that they are never repeated again. In this way, we are reaching the end of today's tragic and moving video. We thank you for staying until the end, and we look forward to seeing you in the upcoming installments of Military History.